Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everybody for attending. I want to thank the witnesses, first of all, for your service to this country. The issues we're dealing with here are challenging to say the least. I was at the opening ceremony with Senator Carper, opening up St. Elizabeth's, and the comment I made there is it's pretty easy from the dais here to criticize, take pot shots, to detail out what problems aren't being addressed as perfectly as we'd like to see. But I am thoroughly convinced from all the contact I've had, quite honestly, the honor and privilege in working with the men and women of the DHS. I'm thoroughly convinced that the men and women are showing a great deal of integrity, dedication, dignity, and courage in trying to deal with this horrific situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I would ask that my written opening statement be entered in the record. This hearing, and it's called The Unprecedented Migration at the U.S. Southern Border, the Exploitation of Migrants Through Smuggling, Trafficking, and Voluntary Servitude, really started a couple years ago with Senator Portman holding a hearing through his PSI subcommittee on example of involuntary servitude at an Ohio egg farm. More recent news stories after the Robert Kraft massage parlor scandal, New York Times wrote a really good investigative story just laying out the reality of these massage parlors and often Asian women that had been smuggled, trafficked in this nation. They come into this country with $30,000 or $40,000 debt owed to their human traffickers, and of course they pay it off through prostitution. Disgusting reality, but that's the reality. My most recent trip to McAllen, I made a couple in the last couple months with Senator Hassan and Senator Peters. There were a couple things that got my antenna definitely twitching. First of all, we were briefed and we were told about the detection of the number of fraudulent families, and we really don't know how large that is. I've seen different things, 13, 25, 33%. We just really don't know. We were told about a 3-year-old boy left in a hot cornfield with just a non-working telephone number in his name supplied, written out, the telephone number is written on his sandal. We saw a picture of that. Senator Hassan, Senator Peters, and I, when we went through the McAllen facility, saw about an 18-month-old little girl struggling to get away from, 40, 50-year-old man, having just been briefed about fraudulent families. I mean, I don't know the truth there, but it didn't look like that was the daughter of that man. I could be wrong, but I couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen to that 18-month-old girl if that wasn't his father, if that wasn't her father. At the border, the last 2 trips I've made, I've been surprised in talking to the people who've just crossed. Women, men with tender-aged children. None of them are admitting to paying their human traffickers any money, which is a concern for me when you also tack on the evidence that we're seeing evidence of these family units showing up at stash houses. Now, the process is, again, completely out of control. We're overwhelmed. People are turning themselves into Border Patrol. Border Patrol is overwhelmed in their facilities. I think something like 19,000 people held at Border Patrol facilities that, according to the now former director of CBP or Border Patrol, the capacity is only 4,000. But trying to process people as quickly as possible, the largest group on record now, 1,000 people coming in through El Paso, and trying to process them, complete their array file, turn them over to ICE. There's a backlog there because ICE doesn't have enough capacity facility to hold it. And then ICE, of course, trying to turn them for unaccompanied children over to HHS where there's not enough capacity, or into non-government organizations to find family members, help them buy tickets to just get dispersed all over America. You'd think they'd be dispersed all over America, but instead, some of them are showing up at some of these stash houses. And then, of course, in testimony we'll hear, stories of those people probably about ready to be put into involuntary servitude, but we have records of people being beaten, videos taken of that, videos sent back down to their home countries demanding payment. Once we got back from that trip, story broke in Wisconsin. I'm going to read you some excerpts from a story that's ran in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel on June 20th. 5 people were indicted in late May in a Georgia-based human trafficking scheme that federal authorities say illegally brought dozens of Mexican workers to work on Wisconsin farms. The defendants, through 2 companies they operated, received U.S. Department of Labor approval to bring the Mexican nationals to the U.S. to work on Georgia farms through a program that allows employers to hire seasonal foreign workers if they can't find domestic workers to cultivate and harvest crops. Thus, the workers were in the country legally. But according to the indictment, the defendants illegally brought the employees to work on Wisconsin farms, gave them false IDs, and took away their passports so they couldn't leave. The workers faced threats and were made to believe they would suffer serious harm if they left. All but one of the workers identified as victims told authorities they had to pay recruiting fees ranging from $200 to more than $600 to be placed on a list to come to work in the U.S. Some say they also had to turn over titles to their properties in Mexico, their families' homes or land as collateral to get the job. The workers said they were left without medical attention when they got sick and were forced to work more than 10-hour days without being allowed to take breaks other than lunch. Some workers said they weren't always provided water, even on hot days. They were told not to talk with anyone outside the company, not to leave their Wisconsin motel without supervision or permission. 2 workers said they were threatened with deportation if they left. Another feared not ever being able to return to work legally in the U.S. if he was deported. Now again, this is the exploitation of migrant workers in the country legally. I have no idea. I was hoping this hearing would give us some sense of how prevalent this is. I don't think we're going to get that. I think we'll hear some other examples. Maybe it's not that big a problem. I have a sense it's a huge problem. I just have a sense it's a huge problem. I think we should get our chart up here. You've all seen this. I've had to turn the piece of paper the long way. Through May, through 8 months of this fiscal year, more than 400,000 unaccompanied children or people coming in as families, generally one adult, one child, have crossed the border illegally and been apprehended and processed and basically dispersed. If we're to maintain May's rate, that number would exceed $800,000 by the end of fiscal year in just 4 more months. Now, I think we've seen a slight decline based on the weekly numbers. It's getting hot. Mexico seems to be doing more, so hopefully we won't hit that 800,000 number. But I don't see how anybody can take a look at this and not realize this is a huge problem that must be addressed, and we're simply not addressing it, not effectively. I didn't have time to have a picture blown up, but we've all seen it, of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his 23-month-old daughter, Valeria. Now, I realize tragedies occur all over this country, all over the world. I don't want to see another picture like that on the U.S. border. I hope that picture alone will catalyze this Congress, this Senate, this committee to do something. I called up Senator Peters earlier this morning. I said I had half a mind to canceling this hearing and instead just have a discussion between what I believe are U.S. senators of good faith that have sat through 30 more hearings of this problem on the border and start coming to some conclusions. What can we agree on to actually start improving the situation? What I have found in 8.5 years here in the United States Senate, there's not much of a problem-solving capability, not for the big ones, not for the big problems. This committee's actually demonstrated pretty good capacity for solving smaller problems on a totally nonpartisan basis, quite honestly. I'm pretty proud of that. We should all be proud of that. Our staffs ought to be proud of that. Just last week in our markup, we addressed the problem of government shutdowns. And Senator Langford, Senator Hassan, I know Senator Portman, Senator Paul had other bills But we passed a bill to end government shutdown. Hopefully the rest of the Senate will pick that up. Hopefully the House will pass that, and we'll never have to have another shutdown again. This is a much more difficult problem we're dealing with here. And so what I propose to Senator Peters, and again, I appreciate the senators we have here at the dais. I'm also talking to the other senators' staffs. And I'm dead serious about this. I want to set up our table down there like a markup, but it's not going to be a markup. And in a very organized process, of organized fashion, I want to go through a problem-solving process. That's what we've been doing with all these hearings. We've been gathering a lot of information. We still need more information. But I want to have an open and honest and genuine discussion about the scope of the problem, the root causes of this problem, and what we can do to start solving it. Continuous improvement. We're not going to solve this overnight, but we can make some improvement in the situation. We have to start doing something. Congress, the men and women at DHS are doing what you can do with limited resources. Congress has to act. And it has to start with an honest and open discussion and conversation. We'll go back and forth, find the areas of agreement. And I don't know that it ends up in an overall piece of legislation or elements that can be tacked onto a piece of legislation that would probably be under some other committee's jurisdiction. But we need to start doing something. It is well past time. And that picture that all Americans woke up this morning looking at, again, should be used as a catalyst for that kind of action. So again, one thing that we're going to try and do, and Senator Peters has been great working with me on this, but hopefully we can sign a letter in support of Operation Safe Return, a pilot program, very small in scope, but a program that is designed to rapidly and more accurately determine those families that clearly don't have a valid asylum claim and safely return them to their home country as a message to people in Central America. Don't indebt yourself to these human traffickers. Don't mortgage your home. Don't pay them a year's worth of salary. Because on a bipartisan basis, we're not going to let the human traffickers exploit our broken system. And then the next step would be to actually start fixing that system. But I think the beauty of the pilot program, Operation Safe Return, is while it's being implemented, we're going to be tracking its effectiveness. We're going to find out how many people actually do have a valid asylum claim. We'll be giving them interpreters. They will have access to counsel. And that's something on a bipartisan basis we can send a strong signal and message that we want to fix this problem. So again, I've yammered on a lot longer than I normally do in an opening statement. But if there was ever a moment where it requires that the nonpartisan effort of the members of this committee, I would say it's now. And so that's what I'm asking for every senator, every staff member in this committee. Let's come together, let's have these discussions. These will be multiple meetings, number of hours. But I'm asking for full involvement and a very open and genuine discussion. With that, Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I can assure you we, all of us on this side of the aisle, also want to work on this issue. It's an important issue, and I think we can hopefully come together and have some solutions to what is a very vexing problem impacting our country and people right now. But I also want to thank you for convening this particular hearing here today, and I look forward to discussing with our witnesses how we can combat human trafficking. This is a horrific criminal enterprise that exploits vulnerable people arriving at the southern border and really all across our country. Desperation drives people into the hands of human traffickers, and that same desperation drives some families to attempt a journey to the north on their own. And like the chairman, and I think everybody on this committee, I speak for all of us, we were devastated by the photo showing Oscar Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valera, who drowned clinging together in the final moments as they attempted to cross the Rio Grande for asylum here in the United States. No one is more vulnerable than a child. And like most Americans, I'm heartbroken that migrant children in U.S. custody, including toddlers and infants, have been subjected to unsafe conditions and sometimes denied basic necessities. It is unconscionable that the administration would argue in court that it should not be required to provide soap and a toothbrush for a child in its custody. Even prisoners of war are provided with soap under the Geneva Conventions. There's no question that children in federal custody deserve basic necessities, including warm meals, blankets, and access to medical care. We must prioritize keeping families together and keeping our children safe and healthy. I have made inquiries to the Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement to learn more about these reports and the conditions experienced by children in U.S. custody. And I will continue working with my colleagues to ensure that they are treated with dignity and receive appropriate care. We cannot fully address the situation on our southern border and keep children safe without disrupting smuggling networks and combating the scourge of human trafficking. Human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world, and it is a serious issue along both the northern as well as the southern borders. My home state of Michigan has the 6th highest number of reported cases of human trafficking in the country. And despite the scope of this problem, there is a lot we don't know about the illicit business of human trafficking. We need a better understanding of how transnational criminal organizations operate, finance, and profit from these smuggling rings. We need to work with Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries to address corruption, lawlessness, and other root causes of immigration. We need strong, stable border security policies. Traffickers thrive on chaos and leverage American threats of future crackdowns to induce families to quickly embark on this dangerous journey. We need less chaos. We can all agree that the status quo is both unacceptable and unsustainable. We all share the goal of protecting vulnerable people from human traffickers. That bipartisan support is reflected in the supplemental funding bill the Senate will soon be considering. This legislation was approved last week by the Appropriations Committee by a vote of 30-1. It includes critical resources to help offices like Homeland Security Investigations root out smuggling networks. We must provide the right resources in addressing the challenges we face at our southern border, and we need a full understanding of the facts on the ground to properly align efforts across the federal government. Chairman Johnson and I share an appreciation for data-driven discussions. We need to improve the Department of Homeland Security's data analytics in order to better combat transnational criminal organizations, disrupt human trafficking, and deliver long-term solutions to secure our borders and protect vulnerable populations. So I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony and hearing more about how we can stamp out human trafficking.
Thanks, Senator Peters. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you'll all stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you'll give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Brian Hastings. Mr. Hastings currently serves as the Chief of Law Enforcement Operations in the U.S. Border Patrol Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was the Chief Patrol Agent of the Buffalo Sector Office in New York. Mr. Hastings.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. It's my honor to represent the men and women of the Border Patrol before you today as they're hard at work addressing the current crisis on the border. Interdicting illegal aliens, drugs, cash, and weapons at the border is a key component of U.S. border security, and by extension, our national security. Cartels and other transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, are a threat that requires comprehensive strategy and an aggressive approach across government. I'm sorry to report that Border Patrol's contribution to this whole of government effort is currently strained, as we're forced to devote 40 to 60% of our manpower to the humanitarian flow that serves as a lucrative line of business for smuggling organizations. We're overwhelmed by the sheer volume of apprehensions and cannot conduct in-depth interviews that provide vital intelligence on smuggling and trafficking networks. While agents are distracted with the nearly 200 large groups apprehended this year, trafficking organizations are using these opportunities to move illicit narcotics and aliens seeking to evade apprehension. Simply put, the current humanitarian crisis has forced us to put border security and national security at risk. TCOs conduct their illicit operations without regard to human life. Smugglers control where and how aliens how aliens cross our border, putting lives at risk. In the Del Rio sector alone, Border Patrol rescues have risen from 44 individuals all of last year to over 400 so far this year. Smugglers are often placing children in nothing more than makeshift raft or on pool toys to cross the dangerous Rio Grande River. On multiple occasions, smugglers have pushed adults and children out of these rafts, knowing that agents would prioritize the preservation of life while the smugglers swam back to Mexico to evade arrest. So far this fiscal year, Border Patrol agents have rescued more than 3,400 people in distress along the border and saved nearly 2,500 people crammed into tractor trailers. Earlier this month, agents freed 14 people from a locked and unventilated trailer compartment that measured 124 degrees. All of these people paid smugglers to bring them into this country and nearly paid with their lives. Others were not so fortunate. This past weekend in the Rio Grande Valley, they mounted an extensive search effort when subjects reported that they had left several children who had died just north of the border. Sadly, on Sunday night, agents recovered the bodies of 3 children and 1 adult in the thick brush. Unfortunately, I know that these will not be the last tragic deaths that we encounter. Summer temperatures are increasing, and we continue to see high volumes of families and children cross the border. Border Patrol has apprehended more than 664,000 illegal aliens on our southwest border so far this year, a nearly 140% increase compared to the same time frame last year. While June is beginning to show signs of seasonal decline that we expect in the summer months, we're still setting record highs. Just 3 weeks into the month, we've already surpassed the apprehension level for every June since 2007. The flow continues to overwhelm resources throughout the immigration system. Border Patrol has made significant investments in humanitarian care, including consumables, soft-sided facilities, medical support, and transportation. We've requested additional funds for this purpose in the supplemental as well. We've been forced to direct manpower away from the border security mission to alien processing simply to keep pace with the high level of apprehensions. We've detailed agents, we've shut down checkpoints, pulled agents from task forces, canceled leave, canceled training to address this crisis. Since we began direct releasing non-processed criminal family units on March 19th, we have significantly reduced the time families spend in our custody after processing. With more than 96,000 family members released so far, this currently represents over 60% of the apprehensions, but only about 25% of those in custody. Together with our partners, we have reduced the number of people in Border Patrol custody from the peak of 19,000 in May to 12 to 13,000 today. Of significant concern are the single adults and unaccompanied children that are spending extended time in custody. Our facilities simply were not designed for long-term care in custody. I cannot stress enough the immediate impact that funding for ICE and HHS bed space would have on the Border Patrol's in-custody population, for both numbers and the duration. In the immediate term, we need Congress to provide supplemental funds requested by CBP and our partners, but the funding will only do so much without a long-term fix. I urge Congress to pass legislative changes that we have repeatedly requested to stop the draw of UACs and families. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chief Hastings. Our next witness is Mr. Randy Howe. Mr. Howe is the Executive Director of Operations for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. In this role, he oversees 30 field offices and 328 ports of entry. Mr. Howe.
Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today on behalf of CBP's Office of Field Operations. When I last appeared before this committee in April, I described the challenging conditions at our ports of entry. I mentioned long wait times for cargo processing and ballooning passenger wait times. I explained the ripple effects that redirecting CBP personnel would have on the trade community, the supply chain, and the American consumer. and I ask that you consider legislation action that would help address this crisis. I wish I could say that the conditions at the ports of entry have improved, or that our Border Patrol colleagues no longer required additional manpower. I also wish I could say that CBP's Office of Field Operations at our ports of entry were able to dedicate all of its energies towards our priority missions: national security, counter-narcotics, economic security, and the facilitation of lawful trade and travel. But the fact is that the conditions at our ports of entry have not improved. Most every statistic is higher. More inadmissible migrants are at our southwest ports of entry, long wait times, more detainees in custody, and more officers from our ports of entry have been redirected to assist the Border Patrol. The variables driving this crisis are the same: unprecedented numbers of family units and unaccompanied children from Central America, many in large groups, and nearly all of them seeking asylum and arriving without proper documentation. And spikes in migration, like the one we're experiencing on the southwest border, can both fuel and conceal human trafficking. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are over 40 million victims of human trafficking globally. In terms of population, that's more than the state of California. 75% of them are female, and a quarter of our children. Due to our unique position at our ports of entry, CBP officers play a critical role in our country's efforts to stop human trafficking. Earlier this month, CBP officers and ICE Homeland Security investigation agents arrested Nassim Jacun Garcia, the leader of an international religious organization, at Los Angeles International Airport. He was charged with human trafficking, production of child pornography, and forcible rape of a minor, among other felonies. Because our officers are among the first people travelers encounter when they enter the United States, we are trained to detect the signs of human trafficking. In addition, our interviews are crucial for identifying victims of trafficking because the interview determines the purpose of their travel. For example, in 2017, CBP officers at Dulles Airport interviewed a woman from Spain who had arrived from Paris with her minor child. The woman stated she was a victim of human trafficking and that a Russian criminal organization was forcing her to work as a maid and have sex with men against her will to pay off a debt. The traveler added that the Russian organization had grown impatient at the rate of the debt was being paid off and were sending her to the United States to earn money more quickly. Alerted by CBP and ICE's Human Trafficking Division, we were able to take the woman and child to a shelter for further processing and interviews. Not every trafficking situation is so straightforward. That's why education is important. In 2013, CBP launched the Blue Lightning initiative to boost awareness about human trafficking in the airline industry. Together with the Department of Transportation, the Blue Lightning initiatives provides training on how to recognize indicators of trafficking and how to report these suspected trafficking to law enforcement. We do everything we can to recognize and intercept human traffickers and hopefully rescue their victims, but we can't do it alone. We work closely in collaboration with ICE and other law enforcement partners. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Howe. Our final witness is Mr. Gregory Navarro. Mr. Navarro is the Assistant Director with Homeland Security Investigations. He previously served as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Mr. Navarro.
Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today to represent the more than 8,500 brave men and women from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations to provide an update on our efforts to combat human smuggling and human trafficking and the ongoing security and humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Throughout my nearly three-decade career, I have witnessed firsthand the perils individuals are willing to endure to seek a better life in the United States. There's no better illustration of this than in June of 1994 when I encountered 11 Romanian stowaways hidden in a container on a vessel in South Boston, Massachusetts. The stowaways spent nearly 2 weeks in the container with limited food and water. fraudulent documents and presented 629 individuals to the Department of Justice for various criminal violations. In furtherance of our efforts to combat this crisis, in early May 2019, HSI initiated a rapid DNA pilot program in El Paso and McAllen, Texas. During this operation, a total of 84 family units were DNA tested after providing consent. 16 family units were found to be fraudulent during the testing. About half of the confirmed fraudulent family units were identified prior to DNA testing, when the adult alien recanted their claim of a familial relationship when asked to consent to the test. There's no better case illustration when a 51-year-old Honduran male confessed prior to testing that he was not the father of the infant child he initially claimed to be his son and purchased the child for $84. In addition to DNA testing, in early May 2019, HSI and CBP began identifying adult migrants and accompanying children that entered the United States as alleged family units along our southern border. However, the children have subsequently departed the United States with unrelated adults via commercial airlines to the Northern Triangle. HSI is currently investigating these incidents to determine if these children are being used and recycled by adult migrants for the purposes of defrauding the United States. HSI is committed to augmenting CBP's resources at our southern border to ensure the safety of children and to prevent them from being utilized by criminal enterprises to exploit our immigration laws. However, without additional congressional support, we will be unable to sustain this effort. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Navarro. Normally, I throw questions out to our committee members right away, but I've got a couple I want to go over quickly. Mr. Hastings, you talked about current levels 12 to 13,000 being held in CBP custody. John Sanders, quoted in the newspaper today, said the capacity of Border Patrol stations is about 4,000. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, sir, that is accurate, and that's across the entire southwest border. So 4,000 is a healthy number. So even though we brought those levels from 19,000 in May, as I talked about earlier, we're still sitting at 12,000 to 13,000 every day, which is well above the capacity levels.
And again, that's the capacity of the standard stations, correct? You've put up things like PGA tents, Adana, we saw those, other types of military tents, the types used by our military in Iraq, that type of thing, correct? Is that how you've expanded capacity?
That is, sir. So, I mean, you have seen in multiple areas, primarily RGV and El Paso, where we have been forced to move bodies out, transport them out, because we're over capacity in that location. We've transported them to either Del Rio sector to process or to Laredo sector to process. To your point, we have stood up additional soft-sided facilities. We've stood up 2 at Donna in RGV, and we stood up 1 in El Paso as well to assist, and there's 1 currently being stood up at Yuma to assist.
So talk about the roadblock, because I know, Border Patrol, you're trying to process, create the A file as quickly as possible, and then turn them over to ICE, correct? I mean, that's the process. You apprehend them, develop screen them for medical conditions, take them to hospitals, do everything you can to, treat them with as much compassion as possible. But your job is really to turn them over to ICE as quickly as possible, correct?
So 2 things. One, yes, we process the family units and the single adults as quickly as possible, and the job is to turn them over to ERO, ICE. The UACs, the unaccompanied alien children, they are our top priority. We process them first, so we can get them entered into the system to be turned over to HHS.
So what's the roadblock in terms of why you're so over capacity?
So 1 is sheer volume. The system is overwhelmed. So just sheer volume alone. If you look back historically, demographically, 70 to 90% of who we arrested, we could easily repatriate immediately back to Mexico. Today, we're seeing 82% of those that we arrest are from other than Mexico. And that population is very difficult to repatriate under the current laws that we have going.
So one of the complaints I heard on the border is from Border Patrols, ICE doesn't have the capacity, so Border Patrol saying, ICE, take these individuals, and ICE say, we don't have the capacity. Is that, and then, of course, ICE, particularly children, go to HHS, and well, we don't have the capacity either. I mean, is that, I mean, it's just kind of backing right up to Border Patrol, right?
It is, so I think everyone in the system, the entire system is overwhelmed right now. That is absolutely correct. We are holding these individuals longer than we want to. We do not want to be holding these individuals for longer than 72 hours. If we could get rid of them quicker than that, that would be great as well. We don't want to be holding kids in detention facilities, our detention facilities, which were not designed for that. If we had 0 in custody, that would be great.
Now, again, there's no incentive. You're not trying to hold children longer than 72 hours. You would like to have them, turn them over to ICE and to HHS as quickly as possible. It's just not possible right now.
As I understand it, HHS is at max capacity, as is ICRO, and they need additional funding for bed spaces.
Mr. Devano, you talked about a case where a child was purchased for $84. You also listed a number of different stats in terms of how many people have been apprehended, number of fraudulent families, fraudulent documents, that type of thing. In the scheme of things, when you're looking at over 400,000 unaccompanied children, primarily people coming in as family units, one of the things I was trying to get a sense of in this hearing is how prevalent the human trafficking element, the sex trafficking, the involuntary servitude is within this process. You obviously have limited resources in terms of how many things you can investigate. I mean, I've heard statistics in terms of how many crimes are actually ever detected or prosecuted or arrests made. What's your sense of how prevalent this is? I mean, do you have any sense whatsoever? Are you as suspicious as I am that there's a lot of this going on? Is your microphone on?
Senator, keep in mind that a lot of times you don't need a border nexus to have human trafficking. So a lot of times it's very difficult for our CBP counterparts at the border to actually identify a human trafficking element or crime. Usually the human trafficking element occurs once they make it into the United States, and that's when we're seeing more of the human trafficking element. So a smuggling event starts off at the border, but once the person gets into the interior, as you mentioned in your opening comments, it often turns into a situation of exploitation where that migrant is then charged, held against their will, their families are exploited back home to pay more money to pay off their smuggling debt.
So let's go back to the process. Border Patrol apprehends, processes, turns over to ICE. ICE then, again, when I was, for example, in El Paso, turns them over to an organization like the Annunciate House, who also helps allocate them to other churches to further care for individuals, but try and identify family members or relatives or some place where they can be sent to. People buy plane tickets, buy bus tickets, and these individuals are sent all over the country. Is that basically what's happening? Again, as rapidly as possible. That's occurring within 6, 7, 8, 9 days in general.
Yes, sir, that's occurring very quickly. In March, we begin releasing non-criminal process families because we were at 19,000. So we begin releasing them, working closely with our NGO partners to provide service for them after release.
Now, when you say you began releasing, Border Patrol began releasing them right, bypassing the step with ICE right into non-government organizations.
That's correct, sir. Our capacity level's at 19,000 and climbing. For the safety of our officers, our agents, and for those that we detain, we begin releasing.
So my final point is, in part of that processing, I think the migrants give you an address where they think they're going to go, correct?
Yes, sir.
But once you turn them over to a non-government organization, you have no idea where they really go.
That's correct. They're provided with a change of address form in case they go someplace else, but where they ultimately go, after we release them or on an order of recognizance, we don't control where they go or how they get there.
And yet, again, the assumption is they're going to meet up with some relative. A lot of people have come in during the Central American Wars from the 80s. So there are a lot of people they know, and they've got social media, but yet we still are finding families in stash houses.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know two of our members, Senator Hassan and Rosen, have a markup, so I would defer my questioning and defer to Senator Hassan.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters, for the courtesy. Thank you to Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Peters for this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here to testify, as well as for your service to our country. And please thank all the men and women you work with on our behalf as well. We all want to make sure that those of you on the front lines have the resources you need. We also want to make sure that you are doing your jobs consistent with American values, and I think that's something we all share. Mr. Howe, I wanted to start with a question to you. It would be great if we could have a brief update on drug seizures at our land ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border. Have we seen an increase in trafficking of any particular narcotic over the past 6 months?
Thank you, Senator, for the question, and thank you for visiting McAllen in May. Our narcotic seizures are on track for to match our numbers from last year. Year to date, we've seized more than 39,000 pounds of methamphetamine, which is tracking a little bit higher than normal. 38,000 pounds of cocaine, 3,200 pounds of heroin, and nearly 2,000 pounds of fentanyl.
And thank you. In particular, have fentanyl seizures increased or decreased over the past 6 months? And what does that tell you about the drug cartel's plans for the trade of fentanyl?
I think we're seeing less through our mail facilities, and it's trending up slightly on the southern border.
Okay.
With the fentanyl.
Right. And of course, while the size of the seizures of fentanyl that you just recounted sounds smaller than the other drugs, 2,000 pounds of fentanyl is an awful lot of fentanyl, given
Absolutely.
its lethality.
Absolutely.
Mr. Hastings, how do Border Patrol's drug seizure numbers compare with CBP's seizures at ports of entry?
Thank you for the question. So we have noticed the hard narcotics generally trending up, and by what I mean specifically, cocaine seizures are up, methamphetamine seizures are up, and heroin seizures are up. Cocaine, about 97,000 pounds cocaine seized so far this fiscal year between the ports of
Right.
entry. About 9,800 pounds of methamphetamine seized between the ports of entry. Heroin, 448 pounds of heroin seized so far between the ports of entry. Marijuana is slightly down at about 200,000 pounds. And fentanyl, although down a little bit at 149 pounds, still obviously very highly concerning.
Well, thank you for the information. Mr. Hastings, I want to turn to another topic. I understand very clearly from my visits to the border, the one I just did with Senators Johnson and Peter and the one I did last year, that we are facing a humanitarian and security crisis along the southwestern border. And I agree with you that we need comprehensive immigration reform in order to help relieve some of the flow of migrants into the United States. However, there is absolutely no excuse for the reported conditions at Border Patrol facilities that house child migrants. Outside lawyers recently visited a Border Patrol facility in Clint, Texas, where they reported widespread instances of children living in squalor, being denied the ability to shower for weeks at a time, caring for infants just a few years younger than themselves, and being locked in cages for the vast majority of the day. Similar reports of gross mismanagement and horrible conditions have come to light at the Border Patrol facilities at McAllen and El Paso, as well as a private facility in Homestead, Florida. I truly understand how overwhelmed Border Patrol is. I think you've done a very good job of highlighting it in your testimony. I certainly saw a great deal of it when I was down at the border just last month. I also understand that CBP needs funding to address this crisis. Hopefully, we will be able to take action here in the Senate on an emergency aid package in the coming days. However, when dealing with children, your first and foremost priority is to ensure that the children in the federal government's custody are treated with the same kind of care, dignity, and support that we would want and expect for any child. To that end, Mr. Hastings, I would like a very clear answer on these questions. First, does CBP have an obligation to provide toothpaste and soap to children in your custody, yes or no?
We're providing that in El Paso, in Clint Station.
The news reports say otherwise, but you now say you do have an obligation to do that.
We have been at the Clint Station, and generally all of our stations across the southwest border are provided with a variety of hygiene products. And even though our facilities were not constructed for the demographic
I
we're
understand
seeing
that,
today,
and my time is limited, so I'm going to cut. I do understand that you are dealing with difficult facilities. I do understand that there is a backup with HHS, which I think HHS could do more to solve. But at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that you agree that children should be provided soap and toothbrush if they are in your custody, which is a different position than what the administration has been saying in court.
We are providing those things now. We have been and we will continue to.
Do you have an obligation to feed, clothe, and clean the children in your custody?
We provide 3 meals, hot meals a day, and snacks are unlimited to those in our
You
custody.
do understand that that is in direct contradiction with the news reports that we have been reading and from what lawyers who have been visiting these children and interviewing them are telling us.
And I would ask that you understand that those are the plaintiff's attorneys who have a case against the government.
And you should understand that I'm a member of the Bar of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and I hold attorneys to very high standards, and I doubt very strongly that any attorney would be fabricating this information.
Understand, ma'am?
What steps is the Border Patrol taking right now to ensure that the mismanagement of child migrants in Clint, Texas is not occurring at every other Border Patrol facility along the southern border?
So all of the allegations that you've mentioned above that were made have all been reported to the Office of the Inspector General and will be thoroughly investigated. They've also been reported to the Office of Professional Responsibility within CBP. They will be thoroughly investigated.
I'm pleased that they will be investigated, but my question is, what are you actually doing to make sure that as you are dealing with an unprecedented number of migrant children, that you are ensuring that there is enough soap and toothbrushes, that there is enough food and enough time for them to be outside and out of very confined spaces? What I'm asking is, what are you operationally doing to change the circumstances? We are hearing reports not just from one facility, not just from 2 facilities, not just from one source, that these children are living in terrible conditions that would violate any standard of any institution that we all would expect in this country. What are you doing to actually make sure that children are getting the care and the sanitary conditions and the food that they need?
So we have done a great deal. As I mentioned earlier, we have brought in shower facilities just for this population, for others, due to the new demographic and how long we're holding them. We've increased our medical contract across the southwest border for medical assessments and medical care. We've increased, as I mentioned in my oral statement, the amount of operational funding that we're spending on consumables, diapers, food, formula, all of those things. If you walk into many of our locations on the southwest border, including Clint, you will see an area, a storeroom, that frankly looks like Costco with these supplies that are available. And when agents are providing these supplies, they're documenting what they're providing. So we have those supplies readily available, and we are offering and providing those supplies now.
I am over time. I thank the chairman for his indulgence. There is a huge disconnect between your testimony and between what we are getting as reports from the facilities. I hope very much that we can just focus on making sure the children are clean, well cared for, safe, and released as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Senator Hassan, we'll work with you to get those answers. One thing I do know that Border Patrol is doing, for example, in El Paso, instead of 28 Border Patrol agents on the border, 25 are caring for children and families, and we got 2 or 3 over that 11-mile stretch, and we're taking OFO officers from the ports of entry and also putting them on the border.
And we saw that at the border. My issue is not with how hard the men and women on the front lines are trying. My issue is what we are doing operationally to change the circumstance on the ground so that these children are well cared for and safe. Thank you.
Right. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Peters, for deferring to our committee. And thank you for the service and work that you all do. It is difficult, it is challenging, and oftentimes heartbreaking. So we do appreciate that. And like the chairman said, we all saw that awful and heartbreaking photo of the toddler who drowned while clutching her father's neck. I can't even begin to imagine as a mother what those last moments for that father and daughter were like. And I believe the mother was on the other side of the river. And I do pray, like the chairman, that this photo and what we talk about today moves this body into action. So let's talk about the Remain in Mexico policy. According to the State Department's Trafficking in Persons June 2019 report, over the past 5 years, we know that human trafficking in 2019, DHS issued a new policy guidance on migrant protection protocols, known as the Remain in Mexico policy. Under this policy, certain asylum seekers, including families, are sent back to Mexico to wait in that country for the entire duration of their U.S. immigration court proceedings. That could take months, could take years. And so we do know that there's a challenge in federal court, but I'm concerned that this policy is going to drive more and more people into the arms of those who wish to exploit them, making the problem worse. And I can tell you that the State Department's own annual report backs me up on this. So my question to you, and I'm hoping that you can provide us the numbers if you don't have them, do you know how many individuals seeking asylum that DHS has returned to Mexico under the Migrant Protocols Program policy? Any of you?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I have the numbers for Office of Field Operations. So for the ports of entry, we've running MPP in San Diego, and to date we've returned 665, and Calexico 96, and El Paso 539, so 1,300.
And how many families were part of arriving as a family unit, excuse me?
I'll have to get back to you on that number. I don't have that.
And also, do you know the number of unaccompanied minors?
Minors would not be part of the program. They're not considered for MPP.
And to your knowledge, are there plans to expand these policies beyond San Ysidro, Calexico, and the El Paso ports of entry?
We are in ongoing discussions internally and with the Mexican authorities on expansion.
So you don't have a timeline for when,
I don't.
and you can report back to us when you do?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I also want to say that reports have indicated that DHS has returned to Mexico asylum seekers who are pregnant or children with neurological disorders. That is despite guidance that clearly states individuals with known medical issues shouldn't be subject to this policy. Have we been investigating these cases? Do you know of any?
I'm not aware of the allegations, but we generally do not include migrants that have a known physical or mental illness. If there's any criminality, a history of violence.
What about pregnant women?
If a migrant is in a long-term pregnancy or their sensitivities to the pregnancy.
Or all long-term pregnancies, or they have an end to the term, but we know the term of that.
Yes, they would not be considered.
Thank you. I have a couple of minutes. I want to go back and talk about metering at the ports of entry. Of course, again, CBP, you have a practice of metering, queue management, as you call it, at the ports of entry all along the U.S.-Mexico border, where asylum seekers are required to wait for indefinite periods for the opportunity just to be processed. Can you talk to me about why you're employing the process of metering or queue management, and is it happening across all ports of entry?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it is. It's a discretionary balance used by our port managers to really balance and assess our mission requirements, our counter-narcotic, our facilitation of trade and travel, and the processing of migrants, and balancing our resources against that. So putting them in all those different areas and without focusing them in any one particular area.
So how can we help you, as Congress, how can we help you speed up this process so you don't have to manage this queue and you can get through?
Well, I think it's the whole process, Senator. It's our facilities that weren't designed to house large groups of individuals, and then ICRO is not in a position to be able to take them. So if we did increase, then we would be holding them longer, and ERO would have an increased difficulty in finding bed space. So it's a balance that right now with ERO and HHS's capacity issues is is adequate.
So we need to have people talking to each other to increase the flow and the capacity of what we can do, and of course, to Senator Hassan's point, doing it in a
Yes.
humane and kind way. Can you tell me, too, the numbers quickly before I end here, how many migrants you are processing at CBP daily?
At our ports of entry? It varies across the southwest border based on that balance, as I mentioned, the discretionary balance of what we're
Can you give me a rough estimate?
300?
And do you know how many are currently in line waiting in Mexico then?
That's difficult to nail down because those numbers come from the Mexican authorities, but we've been told in each one of the areas roughly 3,000 to 4,000.
And so, based on what you know, what do you believe the average time, what do you know as to be the average time an asylum seeker will have to wait?
It's been some time since I've checked with San Diego, but what I last heard a few months ago was 5 to 6 weeks.
5 to 6 weeks. Well, I hope that, again, we can do something about this, that we can help. So many more questions we'll submit for the record about the conditions for children, young families, and we want to be sure that we stop the exploitation, because nothing in my mind is more heartbreaking. I can only imagine when you open that trailer what it did to you and the nightmares you probably have remembering that. So I want that to motivate us to do the right things. Thank you.
So Senator Rosen, because we asked a similar question, I got a response, so to get it in the record, currently as of 6/16, June 16th of this year, 11,575 individuals have been returned to remain in Mexico. 1,109 came from the ports of entry, 10,466 came from Border Patrol. So about 10% come through the ports of entry. The rest have come into this country illegally, and then they're returned. So again, the total number is 11,575. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I want to pick up on those questions of Senator Rosen and that number. So is that the number of individuals turned away at the port of entry under the current metering practices? Just if you could give me a number of that, I want to clarify that. Either Mr. Hastings or Mr. Howe?
Yeah,
How many have been turned away because of the metering process?
That's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify the number that are not crossing the boundary line. In many cases, the NGOs are holding them in Mexico or caring for them until there's an opportunity for us to take on more migrants. That's a communication between us, the Mexican authorities, and the NGO. So it's nearly impossible to
There are not
identify.
folks coming across, and you're saying you can't come across today because of the metering process? You're saying you don't know that number?
We don't.
So, you know, obviously, the tragic situation we've all talked about with his father and his young daughter. The story is that he died after attempting to seek asylum at a port of entry, and he waited for over 2 months in Mexico. What, to both Mr. Hastings and Mr. Howe, what do you think is the relationship between the metering at the ports of entry and an increase in families that we're seeing that are trying to cross between ports of entry?
Sir, I just know that, I mean, we've seen an increase in the volume of family units continue to build month after month. I'm not sure what the result is with the queue management. When we're interviewing these individuals, quite frankly, what they're telling us is, we've heard on social media, or we have heard from folks who are already in the country, bring a child and you'll be set free. I mean, that's what we're hearing.
That's not my question. My question is, what is the relationship? You're metering folks that are coming across the port of entry, so they can't. We know this gentleman who tragically died with his daughter was waiting 2 months and said was turned away from the metering, and so then decided to go not in a port of entry, and we're seeing more and more folks. What's the relationship of people who, if they can't come through a port of entry, they're now trying to cross at other places in the border?
I think it's difficult for me to speculate, Senator, what numbers that occur. I mean, as I said to Senator Rosen, it's that delicate balance of managing our resources at all our different mission sets. And processing migrants is important, but if we were to process more migrants, it's going to have to come from something. So it's not going to come from a counter-narcotic mission. It's not going to come from a national security initiative. So it would have to come from facilitation. And we don't want to, have U.S. citizens waiting longer to return to the United States. So that balance is what we're trying to strike.
Well, we're discussing also trafficking and smugglers and the problem related to that. And so does it make sense that if it's more difficult to come across to port of entry and just present yourself at a port of entry to the legal process, and that you want to go then or attempt to get into the country a different way, that might actually increase the business for smugglers and cartels who will say, we'll take care of the situation for you, just pay us, and we'll get you in some other way? Is there a correlation there? Is there or not?
Again, I think it's difficult to speculate. We do have smuggling attempts that occur at our ports of entry. We have over 400 a year across the southwest border where migrants are either presenting somebody else's documents or they're hidden in a vehicle. So it's difficult for me to know.
Is there anything being done at the Mexican border to ensure the migrants who are waiting to cross are not being recruited by smugglers at the border or being approached to use their services? Are either we or the Mexican government engaged in attempting to disrupt that kind of business connection?
I don't have firsthand knowledge of that, but the Mexican authorities would have that responsibility.
Would we want to know what the Mexican authorities are doing, and would we encourage them to do something along those lines?
Absolutely.
Why has that not been done?
I'm sure it has been done at the local level. Where
Can we find out? Is it possible to get that information?
Absolutely.
I'd appreciate that. CBP has said that between mid-April and June 14th, over 1,800 family units were interviewed who presented indications of fraud, with 275 fraudulent families identified, is based on the data that I have. Chief Hastings, how many total migrants crossed the southern border during that time frame? I believe it's roughly over 200,000. Is that accurate?
Sir, what was the time frame again? I'm sorry.
Mid-April to June 14th. So April, June, 2 months.
April to June, so we've had a high volume, I think 132,000 last month. I can tell you for the year that we've had 5,100 fraudulent claims so far, fraudulent family claims that we know of.
Is that what time frame is that, through recent?
That's for the fiscal year of
Oh, fiscal year.
FY19.
So,
And-
yeah, I'm looking at a 2-month period here.
I couldn't give, I don't have that
That's fine.
specific information, but I think the biggest thing and one of the most important things is, you heard Chief Carish testify last time, it's due to the volume that we're seeing. It's very difficult to spend time interviewing and getting in depth with these individuals.
So my question also is, what do you consider, how do you define a fraudulent family? Is a grandmother and a grandson considered a fraudulent family? Or is an aunt or nephew, is that a adult sibling of a minor sibling? What is a fraudulent family?
So by TVPRA definition, it's a parent or a legal guardian, or that one that is less than 18 years old.
Parent or legal guardian. So a grandmother bringing a grandson would be a fraudulent family.
It's not necessarily counted as fraudulent, they're just not a family unit. They will be, in other words.
So it would show a non-family unit is coming across. A grandmother with her grandson or granddaughter would be considered not a family unit.
That's
Based on
correct.
your definitions.
Yes, sir.
Could you give some examples of the indicators that you would use to warrant them being interviewed as a possible fraudulent family?
A lot of times we'll see just the sheer reaction between the child and the adult. The agents will see that, notice that, and they'll start questioning further to try to determine if indeed it looks like there's a true familiar relationship. We've also saw quite a bit of false documentation, specifically from Honduras and Guatemala as well, birth certificates.
Could you also describe the way the CBP officers identified the migrants that participated specifically in the DNA pilot double helix? At least we're not random sample of families. Is that correct? That these are folks that agents suspected as unlikely to be with a parent before you did the DNA testing?
Thank you for your question, Senator. We sent a team down to McAllen and El Paso, Texas, and the referrals were given to us after Border Patrol had an opportunity to interview those individuals. If there were individuals that they had been suspected of being in a fraudulent family unit, they would refer it to the team that was down there to conduct the DNA testing. This was after interviews, a review of their documents, and as my colleague stated, if the behaviors did not appear to be in a familiar relationship where there seems to be some distance between them, they use those factors to refer that family unit over for a DNA test.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but just one last question. Do you have an after-action report you could share with Congress to assess the viability of implementing DNA testing on a wider scale?
Senator, we did do an after-action report, and we will see about allowing you to see that report. Thank you.
I'd appreciate if you could get that to me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Couple points. Those DNA tests, about $200 a test. If we've had 150,000.
Single adults, rather, that we have in custody as well. So HHS and ERO need funding for bed space to get those out of Border Patrol custody and into the care of those who are set up for long-term detention. That's short-term. Long-term, we need a fix that quits allowing this draw for family units and unaccompanied alien children to come to the United States. We have to stop this draw.
All right. Mr. Howe?
I agree, thank you, Senator. I agree with everything that Chief Hastings said, but in addition, just to underscore the importance of ICE, ERO to get the proper funding and bed space and HHS so that they can relieve our facilities that weren't designed for the long-term detention so we're not in this situation.
Right. Do either of you believe we need to have more border protection? I mean, so far, you talked about the supplemental and the Flores decision primarily. So what about, do we need any funding to secure the border? I mean, this wouldn't be happening if we had a secure border.
Well, right now, I think we absolutely need more funding for border security, but our biggest issue now is pulling away from that 40 to 60% of agents that we're pulling off the line to deal with the humanitarian crisis, the families, and the UACs. That's the biggest problem that we have right now. And in the meantime, while we're dealing with that demographic, a large number of single adults are still trying to evade arrest, to your point. A large dynamic of drugs as well, trying to evade. And they're using these family units who are trying to cross as a diversionary tactic in a lot of cases to be able to make money on drugs and single adults trying to evade arrest.
Mr. Hay, do you like to add anything?
Thank you for your question. We are the investigative arm of Department of Homeland Security, and the concern that we would have is the more resources we take away from conducting the complex criminal investigation, targeting the transnational criminal organizations that are actually organizing these smuggling loads and human trafficking, by putting people on the border to augment the need that CBP has, takes away potentially from conducting our mission, which is, protecting of the homeland via investigations and try to target these transnational criminal organizations.
Mr. Hastings, how does it make you feel when you get asked questions to suggest that you or your team doesn't care about these children that you're taking care of? How do you all feel every day when you get up and you read the papers or see the news where somebody suggests that you're not doing your job?
So it's disgusting to me and it's hurtful to me because daily I see our agents doing just the opposite. Yesterday, I saw our agents in Carrizo Springs jump out of the water, save a 13-year-old child who was unconscious, give him CPR, give him mouth-to-mouth, and essentially bring him back to life. That happened yesterday on our border, and that happens quite often, time and time again. Our men and women are out there risking their lives every day to save those migrants that are either put into a bad position by smugglers or put themselves into a bad position. So above and beyond that, our agents go to the maximum to care for these children. You've seen pictures on the, as well of our agents holding these children, trying to comfort them. So it's very hurtful for us, for our agents who are out there trying to do the best they can at securing our border and dealing with this humanitarian crisis.
How's it impact your ability to recruit and retain your team to do this job?
So our workforce is doing well right now, but they want to see a light at the end of the tunnel, quite frankly, to be able to go back to their primary national security mission. And that's what we're hopeful for, that we go back to a primary national security mission and we see legislative changes that allow us to do that, that quit the draw for the family units and the unaccompanied alien children.
So do you have concerns when you do your job every day that because of how much time you're having to spend because Congress won't act, that we have individuals that are crossing the border that want to harm Americans?
I'm concerned with that. I'm concerned with recruiting individuals in this current state that we're in right now, recruiting good agents to do this in the future. And I'm worried when we're diverted by the humanitarian crisis, what is coming through our border. The best example I could give is about 2 months ago, we had a large group come across in Rio Grande Valley. This is broad daylight. At the same time, we had 791 pounds of cocaine a mile away across the border in broad daylight. That tells me that there's very little fear in the minds of the smuggling organizations and the narcotics traffickers because they know we're tied up with other things. Humanitarian mission.
Anybody else?
Senator, I've been around for almost 3 decades, and I've been used to this, via my career. But I'd like to put it in perspective. Can you imagine a new agent that has just come on, that just went out and had a very successful day? They seized enough fentanyl that could kill hundreds and millions of people, or they arrested a potential terrorist suspect or a gang member, or they rescued a child from an exploitation. And they get home and they turn on the nightly news. And there's information on the news saying abolish certain agencies. Can you imagine how that agent feels? I know personally when I come home, I don't even want to watch that because it's very hurtful, as my colleague stated. So it is very hurtful, and the men and women of ICE, HSI, ERO are out there every day trying to make this country safe.
I'll just add, Senator, it's an unnecessary distraction. Our officers want to be mission-focused. They want to be doing what they were hired to do, enforcing our laws and facilitating legitimate trade and travel. We don't want to be distracted with processing migrants to the numbers we are.
Yeah, I've been here 6 months. I'm disgusted that we sit here and you watch on the news where people are trying to do their job get attacked and Congress sits here and doesn't do their job. It's the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my entire career. My business career, you wouldn't do this in your business career. Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I disagree with what Senator Scott just said? I mean, the behavior of this Congress is absolutely pathetic. I mean, it is just pathetic. People up here should be apologizing to you for the total dereliction of duty that this Congress has undertaken. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life. This is, by my count, the 6th hearing, full hearing, I've sat through in 4 months on the border, which is great. I'm glad we're paying some attention to it. The problem is this Congress never does anything. This Congress refuses to do anything. We know what the facts are. You've outlined them again today. CBP is over capacity, underfunded, undermanned. ICE, over capacity, underfunded. HHS, over capacity, underfunded. Yet this Congress will do nothing. Meanwhile, the cartels and the smuggling rings, what are they doing? They're lying to vulnerable families, exploiting children in order to turn profits and abuse our broken asylum system. And we know what needs to happen. We know we need to reform the asylum system. We know we've got to stop the pull factors as well as address the push factors. We know all that, but this Congress won't do anything. This morning I've heard, just from my colleagues across the aisle this morning, I've heard statements like, I'm heartbroken. No one is more vulnerable than a child. The status quo is unacceptable. It is unsustainable. But yet we don't do anything to change it. And there's no will to change it. Children are being exploited. This morning we woke up to the picture of the man from El Salvador and his young daughter dead face down in the water. Why? Because they were exploited. Who knows how much that poor gentleman paid to some smuggling ring who told him that if he just came to the United States to our border and claimed asylum, he'd automatically get in. That was a lie. Who knows what lies he was told? And here he ends up, he and his little baby dead, and this Congress still refuses to act. I mean, it's just, it is absolutely unconscionable. We know what needs to be done. Nobody will do it. And my view is we can talk and talk and talk, but until this Congress is willing to take some action, I mean, I'm sorry for what it is you have to deal with. I am sorry that this Congress has left you without the resources you need. I'm sorry that this Congress has not done its duty. I'm sorry that this Congress has left not only our southern border exposed and vulnerable, but has left children exploited day after day after day. And until this wretched Congress decides to do something, I don't know why we even bother to have these hearings. I don't know why it even matters, because this Congress will not act. This Congress refuses to act, and it is a complete dereliction of duty. So thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Thank you for what you're doing. And I just hope, I would just say to the president, I'd encourage the president to take every action that he possibly can within the bounds of the law to address this crisis and secure the border, because it is clear to me that this Congress will not act in any meaningful way. And so long as this Congress refuses to act, the president needs to act. And so I would urge him and urge the administration to do everything within their lawful authority to address this crisis, because this Congress is not going to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley, you missed the opening when I described a process that this committee is going to undertake. And obviously the reason we hold these hearings is in the problem-solving process to lay out the reality. And so what I propose, talking to Senator Peters, and hopefully we can do this in as nonpartisan and uninflamed way as possible, but sit down at those tables like we did last week, where we passed the End Government Shutdown Act, a smaller problem, but one that, I think our legislation solved. Senator Langford's legislation, Senator Hassan's legislation, but start working through this problem in a very organized fashion, have open meetings where we discuss these things, and we talk about, okay, what do we need to do? I mean, come from a manufacturing background, continuous improvement. What can we do to start the process? Senator Peters is working right now with me, other members on the letter of support of Operation Safe Return, a pilot program where we can gather information, where we can, surge resources to, I'm not going to repeat it, but we're working on that. But I'm hoping that you'll participate. I hope every member of this committee will participate in this process, a number of meetings, hours long, where we thoroughly discuss these problems, the different elements of the problem, and start coming up with solutions. And again, I don't know if that ends up in a complete piece of legislation, or in those discussions in organized fashion, we come up with different elements that can be tacked onto a piece of legislation. So again, this place doesn't work. It does not have much of a problem-solving capacity. That's a frustration, Senator Scott, that you're certainly relaying. We all experience. And so we're going to do something different, do something paradigm-shifting. And again, whether we accomplish something or not, at least we've had a very, hopefully, thorough discussion. Senator Scott, do you want to?
I don't believe any of it.
Oh.
I sit here preside. I sit here preside this week, and I hear people from Democrats get up there, and all they do is complain about these people. They don't come up there and say, we ought to fix the Flores decision. They don't come up there and say, we ought to secure the border. All they do is try to embarrass these individuals sitting here. It's disgusting what they're doing. I watched it yesterday, presiding, that somebody did it. For what, 15 minutes, just sit there and lambaste them about what they're doing. I mean, look, Mr. Hastings, how many people have you ever worked with that says, I don't care about children. I want to do the wrong thing today.
Just the opposite. I have seen agents on their own go out and purchase toys, bring in for the children to play with. I have personally stopped by and bought meals for those that I had arrested. I've seen agents do the same thing. I've seen agents give up their lunches so people can eat. I mean, I've seen the humane professionalism and outstanding work by our agents since I've been in this agency and long before that.
So Senator Scott.
Do you know what they're doing today? The people that are going down the debate are going to the Homestead facility just to make news, not to solve a problem. They're not up here to solve a problem. They're up here to how do I make some news?
And I fully understand that. I'm as frustrated as you are with the process. I'm hoping this committee will be different. I'm hoping this process will be different. So engage in it. Let's give everybody a chance. Pardon? Again, so let's get around the table like we did last week, and let's see what we can make of this. I mean, again, you got to be tenacious. We have to start moving the football forward, or we can throw up our hands and say we'll never fix this problem. I'm saying that photograph ought to catalyze this, and we ought to try something different and start trying to solve the problem, okay? Senator Langford.
So I want to join my colleagues in the frustration of this day. And I think what we're experiencing today is some pent-up, abject, total frustration. March the 28th of this year, at that time, Secretary of DHS came to this hearing and then followed up with a letter, and this was the exact quote from her. "We now face a system-wide meltdown. DHS facilities are overflowing, agents and officers are stretched too thin, and the magnitude of arriving and detained aliens has increased the risk of life-threatening incidents." Then she said, "My greatest concern is for the children who are put at high risk by this emergency, who are arriving sicker than ever before after traveling on the treacherous trek." But instead of actually providing funding during that time period, this Congress delayed and didn't provide the funding, didn't engage, didn't try to solve it. That same secretary over and over and over again said none of this gets better until the Flores agreement settled. I've had personal conversations with Democrat and Republican members on this committee and said, at what point do we finally admit the obvious statement that the Obama administration made, that the Trump administration made, that if we don't resolve the Flores settlement, none of this ever gets better because traffickers will continue to move children across our border. But children are currently being used as pawns now on the border to try to hurt the Trump administration. And my Democratic colleagues are trying to identify children that are not getting care, at the same time slowing down the process of getting humanitarian aid to try to hurt this presidential election. These kids are not pawns, and the administration has said for month after month after month, we need additional humanitarian assistance. But here's what's happened. Nothing happened after that meeting in March. May the 1st, HHS sent us a protracted letter to try to get additional assistance and saying that we're at a crisis moment. May the 17th, they contacted us again and said we're at a critical moment. Secretary Azar from HHS came back and said at that same time period, we're at a critical moment. We tried to move a humanitarian relief package with the disaster relief package on May the 22nd, and Leader Schumer came to the floor and made this statement: the Democrats are ready to pass the bipartisan disaster relief package that's already been agreed to and written, but we should pass disaster agreement as is and return to unrelated issues at a later date. Unrelated issues is this humanitarian issue. To say these unrelated issues are slowing down our disaster work, so we'll put the humanitarian work off till later. And then yesterday, Senator Schumer was back on the floor criticizing the president and criticizing all of these folks and their agencies, saying, why aren't you taking better care of the kids? When this committee has talked about it for months, y'all have asked for it for months, and all we've got to is we'll get to unrelated issues later. Now, I'm tired of people calling my office and saying, how come you don't care about the kids? I'm sure you're tired of reading in the media every day, how come you don't care about the kids? If 500 people showed up your house tomorrow and said, I'm going to stay here for a week, would your house be ready to take 500 people? What would you do if 500 people came to your house tomorrow and said, I need to stay here? Y'all are having to manage thousands of people showing up at facilities that are not prepared for thousands of people that never have been, and that are certainly not set up for kids. And the whole time we argue about what are we going to do when everyone knows the issue. It's the Flores settlement. Every smuggler uses that, and we won't acknowledge it, and there's been a dramatic slowdown on trying to actually get humanitarian aid. Now the Senate comes to an agreement, finally, on a humanitarian aid, and the House responds with a solely partisan bill and says, no, we're going to try to do a partisan bill. And then the conversation this week was, well, we may not get to the humanitarian bill this week if we don't get a certain vote we want on the NDAA. As Democrats, we may hold off the humanitarian bill in NDAA for 2 weeks from now. Yet another delay because it's an unrelated bill. So I don't know if we get the humanitarian vote again this week because Democratic leadership is postponing again while going to the floor and saying, why isn't the Trump administration doing more about this? You can't have it both ways. This is not about hurting the president and his presidential election hopes for next year. This is about a group of kids that we need to reduce the incentive for them to be able to come illegally across our border, and we need to take care of the folks that are already here. This is not that hard. But it's become this horrible partisan issue that I think all of us are really frustrated with, to say this has been discussed to death. We've got to be able to act on this. So I want to ask just a couple of stats. How many folks are coming across as males at this point and claiming to be 17 years old? Is there a disproportionate amount of males crossing the border and saying, I'm 17?
Sir, I don't have the exact numbers, but I can tell you that we're seeing a higher number of families with fathers as the primary, they're the primary parent that's coming across. So we're seeing an increase in fathers with children. I don't have the exact numbers with me.
How many countries have you seen crossing our border with minors?
So 140 different countries that we have seen apprehensions that we have made from 140 countries, 52 countries for family units. So we have family units from 52 different countries that have crossed into the U.S. this fiscal year.
And that's just this fiscal year, so that'd be since October 1 of last year.
That's correct, sir.
82% of the people you testified, people that are crossing the border, are coming from countries other than Mexico at this point. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Guatemalan authorities that I met with this week have stated that DHS has worked very hard with them, and the Guatemalan authorities are continuing to be able to work because, quite frankly, the Guatemalan authorities don't want those kids also making this trek, and they're trying to do what they can to be able to slow down the flow from their side as well. And they were very appreciative of the work that DHS has done to be able to partner with Guatemala specifically. Now, I'm sure if I talked to the Honduran authorities and the El Salvadoran authorities, they would say the same. But the Guatemalan authorities this week were very grateful to our government and the work that they're doing to be able to help not only protect those kids, but quite frankly, they want their kids back home to be able to be there. And they're a little frustrated by this whole journey as well. And as a country, we have put hundreds of millions of dollars into Central America, into the Northern Triangle for quite a while to help stabilize those governments and continue to be able to do that, to be able to provide a safe place that's there. So all of this conversation about we're doing nothing to be able to help the issues there really is we are doing a lot of things to be able to help the issues in Central America. What's not being done is deal with the pull factors here in the Flores settlement. And frustratingly enough, also not the humanitarian assistance. With that, I yield back.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was here earlier and had the opportunity to hear you, Mr. Hastings, and hear some of the discussion with my colleagues, Senator Johnson, in particular on what's going on at the border, and also from Senator Peters. And I think there is now a consensus, I certainly hope so, that we're facing a crisis. It's an immigration crisis. It's also, by the way, a drug crisis impacting my home state of Ohio and every state represented in this dais. Crystal meth is now coming in unprecedented numbers, as an example. We already knew the heroin was coming in. Crystal meth's coming in entirely from the Mexican border now, we're told. It's also a humanitarian crisis. There's no question about it. And the men and women who you represent are being put in an impossible position. And I hope that every member of this body protects the right of American law enforcement to do their job. And it's a tough job, but I think you're doing it in a professional way, and I know it's difficult. I guess what I would like to focus on is solutions. I do think there are some potentially bipartisan solutions, and I want to hear from you on it. One that has always struck me as a reasonable approach that we should be taking, which was done during the Obama administration, is to have people apply from their home country. They would apply technically as refugees from their home country because you claim asylum when you come into the United States. The criteria are the same. The criteria that have to be met are the same that are eventually adjudicated over here. We're finding about 15% of those who apply for asylum actually receive asylum. That number, may not be entirely accurate going forward, but the point is, most people who are applying are not receiving it. Why? Because they're deemed through our judicial system to be economic refugees, probably, and not meeting the criteria. But what if we set up a system, as was done, again, in the Obama administration, where people, instead of being told by the traffickers, you've got to come on this arduous journey, and we're going to mortgage your house for you, and we're going to take your paycheck for the next half year, and we're going to take your kids, because if you're a kid under the Flores decision, then you can't be held in detention for more than 20 days. Instead, the traffickers had to say, you got to apply here. You got to apply from country. Now, two things would have to happen. One, we'd have to raise the cap on refugees, which has been lowered during this administration. That should be acknowledged. And it would require specifically a cap to be raised for Central American countries. Second, we have to provide the resources. Although, as you know, with refugee resettlement, primarily that's done through international bodies, including the UN, refugee resettlement operations. So this is something that could be internationalized. I've talked to a number of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle about this. They haven't said no. It certainly makes sense as part of an overall strategy, in my view. The pull factor is the fact that you can misuse our asylum system now. It's also the fact that you can get a job here in America and make 10 to 20 times more than you can make in your home country. If I was in that situation, or you were, you'd be tempted to do the same thing. Doesn't make it right. So one way to do this is to have people, instead of being told you got to make this journey up north, is to say you got to apply right here. Let's adjudicate these cases. Let's provide the funding for it. Let's use the United Nations and other international bodies. Now, that reduces the flow in a substantial way. I just wondered if any of you, Assistant Director Novano, you may have some thoughts on this, Mr. Howe, Mr. Hastings, but if you had any thoughts on this idea of going back to a system where people apply from their home country.
Thank you for your question. I'm not as versed in that area, but the argument that you make seems to make sense, and I am familiar. Back in my younger career, I actually did process refugees, and a lot of Vietnamese, Russians back in the early 90s, and it was an effective system that worked. So I could see the merits of that system and look forward to working with Congress, working with our partners, if that is something that is decided, to try that out and see if it's something that can help stop this crisis.
Yeah, and I know you're familiar with this, but the criteria you use to determine whether somebody was eligible for refugee status is the same criteria we use for the asylum status.
Yeah, it's just a difference of the section of law. I believe is Section 207 of the INA and Section 208 of the INA is a difference, but the statutes are very similar, like you mentioned, whether they apply here in the United States or apply outside of the United States.
There's also a requirement, should somebody receive refugee status, that there's assistance provided. Usually it's through a private sector entity, but the federal government plays a role. Refugee resettlement, we're all familiar with. So it's a little different process, but it keeps people from coming up to this border. It keeps the numbers we see here, hundreds a day, thousands a week, hundreds of thousands a month, from coming up to our border. Instead, they're told, if you want to apply for this status, you got to do it back home. Mr. Howe, Mr. Hastings, any thought on this?
Senator, yeah, I'm very intrigued
Matter
by
of
it.
common sense?
I think, yeah, it's probably common sense. It reduces the pull factors. We'll let our lawyers work out the details, but if it can be done, if it's been done before, and working with the State Department and our international partners, it just makes sense.
Mr. Hastings?
Thank you, sir. I would welcome anything that allows our Border Patrol agents to get back to the primary mission of securing our borders and reduces the flow.
Yeah. Your testimony earlier was striking to me when you talked about the fact that 40 to 60% of your people have been pulled off their jobs, essentially, to deal with the humanitarian crisis. I understand why they're doing it. They have to do it. We want to be sure that we're providing the emergency care that so many of these migrants need, but that's not their job. And that leads me to my final question, which is about the drug issue. When the Border Patrol is not on the border trying to detect and stop these illegal drugs from coming into our country that are killing the people I represent, that creates a whole other crisis. It's not on the border, it's in Ohio. It's in every state represented in this dais. And maybe Mr. Navarro, you can talk a little about these transnational trafficking groups that are smuggling people, but also smuggling drugs at the same time. What can we do better to be able to detect and stop this poison from coming into our country? Crystal meth. You know, back in the day, we had meth labs in our states. People made meth in their basements or their homes, and environmental problems with that, obviously, in addition to this poison being made that was harming our communities. You don't see that anymore. Why? Because the crystal meth from Mexico, pure crystal meth, is so cheap and so powerful. I'm told by law enforcement in Columbus, Ohio, it's less expensive than buying marijuana on the streets now, and it is killing people. So, Mr. Navarro, what can we do to stop some of these drugs from coming in, and how are they related to these transnational gangs that also get involved with trafficking people?
Well, I had the opportunity to testify before your committee before about the opioid addiction in the United States, and I know you were very well aware that we initiated a border enforcement security team in the state of Ohio that I know you were present for. That's a recent occurrence that we're trying to stop the opioids flow into the state of Ohio. But our border enforcement security teams, we have 65 of them across the country. And those teams are crucial because it takes resources from state, local, and federal authorities to attack a problem. And the more border enforcement security teams that we have to tackle the drug problem, I think the better we can identify it. Also, to continue our capacity building overseas, we have trained what we call transnational criminal investigative units. We have 16 of those stationed all across the country. And all over the world. And those individuals are dedicated and are eyes and ears overseas to help provide us the intelligence, the information, and execute the laws that we don't have the authority to do so in the Central America area, in Mexico, and the drug-producing countries. So we rely very heavily on our trained partners and our transnational criminal investigative units.
Thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper.
Thanks very much. Normally we just ask questions of our witnesses. I'm going to use this as a chance to have a colloquy with two of my colleagues who I have a lot of high regard and affection for. And I might ask you a question, but I may not. But it seems peculiar to me, as I was putting together a congressional delegation earlier this year, and we looked at the flow of folks coming here from Mexico over the last, 15, 20 years. And as you know, there are more Mexicans going back into Mexico these days than there are Mexicans coming into the U.S. And we looked at getting ready for our CODA, we looked at illegal immigration numbers through the end of last October. And this was about maybe the very beginning of this year. But we looked at immigration numbers through the end of October. And my recollection was that in the previous 15 years, illegal immigration from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador had dropped by, illegal immigration across our southern border over those last 15 years through the end of October, it was down by just a little over 80%. And I was almost ready to declare victory. In the months since then, 5, 6 months since then, actually 7, 8 months since then, we've seen this surge, this incredible surge of illegal immigration from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. What's happened with Mexico? Pretty much the same. I mean, and when I say pretty much, it's been pretty much what it was been for years. They're not surging from Mexico. They're not coming in. There's still, I'm told, more Mexicans going back into Mexico than there are Mexican Americans coming into the U.S. Why is it these three countries? But we've not seen this kind of surge from Mexico. They have poverty there, they have crime there, and so forth. Why aren't they coming? And there's a great need for leadership on this issue, and I think it has to come from this committee. And I've heard the chairman say any number of times this committee has a great record of history of bipartisanship. And frankly, I think this committee attracts people who like to get things done, work across the aisle, and look to build consensus. And we really see an opportunity here. It's a very sad situation. We also see an opportunity to fix it. And I would like for us to be the committee that provides that kind of leadership. I'm not interested in pointing blame. I could easily say in response to some of my colleagues just pointed at this administration, point out all their sins. I'm not going to do that. But let's see what we can do to fix this problem. And I want to sign up to do that. And I look at the four of us, and if the four of us can't work this out, nobody can. I mean, this is just ripe for our working on it. Do y'all have anything else you want to say with that spirit that I've just tried to kindle here? Anything you want to say in response to that? First of all, I just thank you all for what you do with your lives. When I was chairman of this committee, I used to go to the floor every month and talk about different units of the Department of Homeland Security and praise the men and women for the work that they do. We're just out there, Chairman and I were out there for the opening of the new Department of Homeland Security, St. Elizabeth. It was a very exciting day. But just in the spirit of what I've just said, I'd like for you guys to say something.
Well, just thank you, Senator, for what you've said and your commitment to work together to work out legislation or whatever needs to be done to address the crisis. The men and women on the border work hard. They're proud of what they do, and let's mission focus them on what they need to do.
All right, thanks. Anybody else want to say something?
Sir, appreciate it. And again, for the men and women of the Border Patrol, we would just ask for, to work on the legislative fixes, please, to allow them to get back to doing their primary mission.
Mr. Lama, Greg.
I'd reiterate what my colleague says. Thank you for addressing the issue. Whatever you can do to help us out. Again, we want to focus on the transnational criminal organizations and focus on the large criminal networks that are actually exploiting these individuals. Whatever you can do to make us get back to doing that type of work and less dealing with the border crisis, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
You bet. The Chairman and I have oftentimes said in this room that we have to focus on root causes. It's they're pull factors or push factors, but some of the situations we've seen in visits down to Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, if we were living down there, we would want to get our kids and our families out of there too. And somehow it's gotten a lot easier. It's gotten a lot easier. People used to have to walk 1,500 miles in all kinds of bad weather and danger and so forth, and they still do it. But now they can get in a bus and come on up an air-conditioned bus and be dropped off at the border, and a lot of people are doing it. And those, the coyotes, the folks that are running these operations, they're very entrepreneurial. They can find all kinds of ways to make money, including on the bus service business. And we got to be smart enough to figure out how to shut that down. And we can't do it by ourselves, but the Mexicans, if we're ever going to get this, USMCA can confirm that. I'm not saying that should be one of the conditions, that they work with us to shut down those buses, but that'd be part of it. There are all kinds of things we can do. The other thing I would say is we've been working now for about 3 years on Alliance for Prosperity, as you know. And it's not the whole answer. It's part of the answer. I like to say there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of silver BBs, some are bigger than others. I think one of the big BBs is making sure that we address the root causes of why people are trying to get up here: lack of economic opportunity and hope, crime and violence, corruption. And what we're trying to do with the Alliance for Prosperity is to address all three of those. Sadly, when we look at the supplemental and the president has cut off that funding to the Alliance for Prosperity, suspended it. And when we look at the legislation, the supplemental focuses on the border and illegal immigration, we don't restore it, which I think is a mistake. So we got to be able to, I'd like to say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We got to address those root causes, and we got to address the pull factors as well. And I sign up for doing that, and I suspect my colleagues to my left would do so as well. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Senator Carper, let me say I appreciate your willingness to participate in this process, and it's going to be a different kind of process. It is going to take advantage of, I think, the nonpartisan attitude by so many members of this committee. And we've spent more than 30 hearings gathering information, trying to define the many root causes of this problem. I continue to say the primary root causes is America's insatiable demand for drugs, which has given rise to drug cartels, destroyed these public institutions. But having been a manufacturer, having solved a lot of problems, there's a process you go through, and that's what I want to see this committee engaged in. You know, not here at the dais, but down there with genuine conversations, and we do it in a very organized process, trying to address all the complexities of this, but also then trying to find, the priorities. What are the things that we have to fix now? In the here and now, what are the longer-term solutions as well? So I'm absolutely dedicated to doing this. And it's going to be a completely different process than, this Senate's been participating in as long as I've been a senator. And it's going to be genuine conversation. It's going to be, I think, senators with goodwill recognize the problem and working toward real solutions. So again, I appreciate that, and all you have to do is show up. but we're going to be holding multiple multiple meetings, and they will go on for quite some time. And I'm just, you know how tenacious I am. With that, Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Our nation faces a crisis along the southern border, and I'm committed to continuing our bipartisan work to strengthen border security, stop the flow of migrants to our southern border, and ensure fair and humane treatment of the migrants who do come. The situation on the ground in Arizona with our communities, our NGOs, and our border workforce is not sustainable. So I want to make sure that we're working together to develop bipartisan and common sense solutions. These solutions have to include measures that push back against the human traffickers and the criminal organizations who prey on migrants. And I'm pleased that we're having this hearing, and I look forward to our discussion. My first question today is for Mr. Navarro. According to recent data, over 590,000 migrants have crossed our borders just this fiscal year. And all along the over 2,000-mile journey from Central America to Arizona, migrants are targeted by criminal elements: human traffickers, smugglers who transport migrants through Mexico for a fee, and other criminals who are seeking to hurt these families. Of the migrants who are coming to our border, approximately how many have had some interaction with a criminal element during their journey to the United States? And how many of those migrants received assistance on their journey from smugglers?
Senator, thank you for your question. I'm not sure that anyone can give the exact numbers as far as, the estimates that you're asking for. However, I would say to make that 1,500-mile journey, it's very difficult to do that on your own. And these smuggling organizations are recruiting these individuals, making false promises to them about getting into the United States, making a better life, promising them lucrative jobs when they get here. And once they get here, the traffickers take over and put them in totally different circumstances. So I will say that in order to make that journey, a very high percentage of these individuals are seeking assistance, paying upwards of $7,000 to $8,000 for that journey to make it to the border, thinking they're coming for a better life, only to be exploited once they pass, the border, whether between ports of entry or through a port of entry.
And Mr. Navarro, regarding these smugglers who are, quote, assisting individuals to come to this country, do you have any information about how closely linked they are to transnational criminal organizations that work to ship drugs as well as people across the border?
Sure, that's a very excellent question. So what we term illicit pathways, these illicit pathways are controlled by the cartels. They're used to bring narcotics through those pathways, and they will use them to bring people. The smugglers, the transnational organizations, criminal organizations, don't care what the product is, whether it's a commodity, whether it's a person, they use those same pathways. And the human smugglers may have to pay a fee to the cartels to use those pathways to come up. But there's a direct correlation between the pathways used for smuggling narcotics as there is for smuggling persons.
Thank you. My next question is actually for all of the panel. I'd welcome all of your thoughts. It's clear to me and to many Arizonans that our nation faces a direct threat from these smuggling operations, and of course, they're taking advantage of people in Central America. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what our national strategy is to defeat this threat, and what are some of the steps that your agencies are taking to counteract these criminal transnational organizations.
Thank you, ma'am. So for the Border Patrol, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I will say it's very hard to delve into, interview, and to follow through with getting the proper intelligence when we're just trying to get the throughput. Yeah. When we are overwhelmed by the mass amount of UACs and families that are coming into our facilities, it's very difficult to take the time to delve into a smuggling case. We try the best of our ability, but we also are trying to balance that with the humanitarian crisis that we currently have. So it's very difficult, and that's why we would again ask for the legislative changes that stop this draw, so we can go back and focus on the smuggling, focus on the trafficking, focus on the DTOs that are bringing thousands of pounds of narcotics into our country through the ports of entry and in between the ports of entry.
Similar to Chief, thank you, Senator. Similar to Chief Hastings, we're in the interdiction phase, so we're identifying the smuggling attempt and stopping it. I mentioned earlier, on average, about 400 criminal prosecutions on the southwest border for people that are trying to be smuggled in the United States. And so we're on that front end of it. So the back end, that investigation really is through our ICE partners to get into the details of the DTOs.
Senator, the paradigm of effective border security starts 1,500 miles out with capacity building and training foreign police officers to interdict, train them, provide them the equipment, and that's something that Homeland Security is doing to attack the problem foreign. We know that doesn't always work, and our brothers and sisters at Customs and Border Protection are the interdictors. So there's definitely a border security at our borders, but interior enforcement is equally as part of that three-prong approach to the paradigm of border security, and that is taking the pull factor, the magnet away from them by having an effective worksite enforcement strategy, because worksite enforcement bleeds several other collateral crimes. These individuals, once they get here, they know that they're promised a job, and that's where the human trafficking, the fraudulent documents, the identity benefit fraud, that's where all that happens, the false promise of a job. So it has to be a three-prong approach to effective border security.
I appreciate that. A quick follow-up question. Director Hastings, you mentioned changing American laws, which I think we could all agree is difficult in our current political climate. What I'm looking for, and really am grateful to be working with the chairman and others on this, are ways to help the administration improve the credible fear process. So that's something that we're working on to try and figure out how can we do that given the difficult partisan political climate that we're living in. But I'm also really interested in figuring out how do we disrupt these smuggling networks so that they no longer see a financial benefit and they don't see this as a smart business plan to bring groups to the United States and try to exploit the so-called loophole.
So for us and what we hear in the field, and I shared this earlier, but it is from those who we interview time and time again, frankly, what we're told is from social media or from a family member here or from a friend here, I've heard, bring a child and I'll be released within 10, 20 days. And until there is something that can address that flow, allow us to keep that family unit together, and allow us to run them through the proper cycle to allow them to have their due process and due rights, and then return them if there's no credible fear, and apply a consequence. If we're not applying a consequence, then we're going to continue to see this issue.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the exact issue that we're working on to try and figure out how do we get folks and families, I'm talking about legitimate families, not the illegitimate ones that we see. How do we help process families in a timely manner to address the Flores issue while also sending a clear message back to those Northern Triangle countries that this is not an effective strategy to get into the United States of America. It's going to be difficult, I understand, but that is something that we're very interested in doing, is figuring out how do we help process families and folks faster to actually get folks back home if they don't qualify for asylum or for some other legal status of entry to our country. Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired.
Well, Senator Sinema, first of all, thank you for working and cooperating with me and my staff on Operation Safe Return, along with Senator Peters, so hopefully we can get that letter of support and DHS can implement that as just a first step to provide that consequence with real care and compassion. So thank you for your efforts there. I want to thank, again, the witnesses for just your service to this country. Chief Hastings, thank you for providing that example of a Border Patrol officer pulling somebody out of the river, applying CPR, saving their life. That's just an example of, I'm sure, thousands of examples of compassion, the type of care that the Border Patrol, ICE, the DHS really provides people. This is, we saw passion today at the hearing, which is, that's good. It shows that the members of this committee are deeply concerned and want to get to a solution. So what'll be my job is turn that passion into commitment to actually act. So again, I want to thank all of you for your service. I want to thank Senator Sinema, my colleagues on the committee, and again, my commitment. We will start holding these meetings where we will have a genuine and robust discussion in that problem-solving process. And it will result in good ideas, areas of agreement, and possibly a full piece of legislation, or if not, elements, components that can be added to other legislation that other committees may take up as well. But this committee has led on this issue. I don't think any committee has held more hearings, gathered more information, sought to understand this problem in all its complexities more than this committee has over the last 4.5 years. And now it's time to turn that into action. And again, I think we've got the members of this committee. Senator Sinema is one of them. that really will come to that table right here in this committee room, probably starting the week after we return, and have those robust discussions to come to some agreement and start solving this problem. So, again, thank you all. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 11th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.